Now then, on paper, the promise and the potential of the Continental Free Trade Area is massive. There really isn't any other policy drive that, for example, can raise at least 30 million Africans out of poverty if properly implemented. So what then are the obstacles to its full implementation? I explored those issues with the head of the Africa unit at the IMF a little earlier. This is part of that conversation.
What's standing in the way really are two things. First, the tariff itself. For example, on average, tariffs are around 6% between, in the region, compared to say 1% between Asian countries. So there is a bit more scope to reduce tariffs. But we think working on non-tariff barriers is also as important. So excessive red tape in terms of the flow of goods, facilitating more trade, including by providing more trade credits between each other, are all going to be really, really important.
When you make this pitch, to finance ministers, and I'm sure they're familiar with the potential of trade, across our borders, across our regional economic communities, they might say, yeah, but I have to make a trade-off here to some extent between, if you tell me to reduce tariffs, I'm essentially losing revenue. Yeah. Same revenue that I need to essentially fund government operations. And as some of your reports have pointed out, fiscal room is very, very limited. So doesn't that provide an incentive for them to say, okay, tariffs might take a bit of time to come down, but we can do something on non-tariff?
Okay. So, over the years, actually, government's reliance on trade taxes, the excises, tariffs, has reduced tremendously. So yes, there continues to be some reliance on, tariffs to fund government operations, but it's way less than it used to be in the 90s, 2000. So the loss is not going to be as much, particularly relative to the gain. And this also speaks a little bit to the need to recalibrate, to reframe tax bases, move them away from relying excessively on tariffs and more on indirect taxes, more on consumption. Yeah, indirect taxes are consumption, on consumption goods, but also, really something that we've not done enough relative to the shift in the structure of the economy in our region, is to think about how better to tax, the services sector, for example, finding ways in which to get the informal sector to become more formal and pay taxes.
But how then do you deal with I'm just looking at the sort of arguments that politicians and policymakers more often than not tend to make, and the paper sort of points this out, because if you look at the amount of liberalizing trade measures versus protectionist trade measures, the protectionist curve just goes straight up, right, compared to where the liberalizing measures are. And even within East Africa, within COMESA, we've seen examples of that, where, for example, Kenya says, no, we need more time to protect our sugar sector because we need to reform it. And yet that's often not followed up by actual concrete measures to liberalize that sector, to reform that sector. The protectionist instinct is still extraordinarily strong across the continent.
There are a lot of political economy issues that have to be considered when you're doing trade reforms. But I think in general, we know that benefits are there. Okay. And I think there are a couple of ways that this can be tackled. I think first and foremost is to make a credible commitment and a path under which these tariffs will be reduced over time, and lock that in and stick to that path. So this is a way to give companies that need a bit more time to become more competitive, to address the reforms that have to be undertaken by governments. So you can give it time, but make it a credible, time-bound commitment. Second, and to the extent that there are going to be losers, identifying and finding ways in which you can, finding alternative ways in which you can protect the people that are going to be losing is going to be important. But the last thing I want to say is that, these protectionist instincts are not unique to our countries, are not unique to our economies.
So let's just talk about standardization for a bit more, because that, does seem to be one of the other key areas that, of course, needs a lot of attention. It's one thing if you're going to say we're setting this standard for milk, for example, across East African Community, COMESA, SADC, then it has to be this one standard. But in some cases, not all countries might not be able to meet those standards. So there's all these, because for various reasons, might be capital intensive to meet them. There might be skill issues that they need to sort out. That path towards standardization is just as important to sort out.
Absolutely, and the standards that are being set, the regulations that have been set, have also need to be set with an eye to the production capabilities of our economies, of countries. So if you set a goal which no country meets, that's not good. If you also set a goal which only some countries meet, that also is going to give some countries the leg up and raise exactly the kind of concerns that you have about the countries that may not be there, not signing up to these agreements. So it is something that's going to have to be negotiated, discussed, countries being given time when they meet the standards. But I think unless you have that kind of predictability, it's going to be difficult to move forward with the reforms.